Hey guys, I'm Elysium. This story is all about what if Naruto was the owner of a cafe diner. Even the gods and goddesses of Olympus needed a day off. Sometimes they needed time away from the constant bickering and never-ending controversies of their family. On one such day, Wisdom and Moon found themselves discovering a hidden gem within the city that never sleeps, and meeting a familiar blonde knucklehead with a penchant for the color orange. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 9, Part 9. Where are you going? Melino heard, her face pointing in the direction that led towards Elysium. The souls that came to the underworld divided into three sections, with Elysium, the fields of asphodel and the fields of punishment stationed next to one another like three separate islands. Elysium consisted of a valley surrounded by walls, a gated community from which one could hear laughter and the smell of barbecue. The path that led towards Elysium was a golden brick road that started from the Judgment Pavilion and ran through the center of the underworld. On the left was a black brick road that led to the fields of punishment, and to the right was a red brick road that led to the fields of asphodel. All souls had to go down one of these roads, but for today, the only one she was interested in was the one that led to mortal paradise. Ever since she visited the fox's den with her father, and met Naruto Uzumaki, the blonde mortal had been on her mind night and day. Not in the romantic sense, but in the sense that he was a puzzle that needed solving. His feelings and connections towards several souls that resided deep within Elysium was something she couldn't shake, and she needed to find out what was going on. She never felt threads connected to souls as old as the ones he possessed. No other mortal in the world had anything close, and it only deepened the mystery. What made him special? Her father had no idea she was here, and neither did the Natos. However, despite their absence, the womanly voice behind her had been expected. Turning around, the goddess of ghosts did not appear surprised when a set of vivid green eyes, reminiscent of Greek fire, stared at her in idle curiosity. Hecate was one of the most bizarre goddesses within the Greek pantheon, and one of the few that had been around longer than her father and the other elder Olympians. While technically born a Titan, she was an integral part of the system that ran the world, and the one that created and maintained the barrier that kept their world and the mortal world separate. Without her witchcraft and the mist, the world would look very different from the one they knew. Dressed in a chiton of green silk to match her eyes and dark hair cut into a bob, the goddess of witchcraft stared at her, waiting for an answer. I have a matter I need to attend to in Elysium. It's nothing serious, but it's something I would like to finish off sooner rather than later. The answer wasn't enough to satisfy the older goddess, who took one step closer to the daughter of the Dark One. Is your father aware of this matter? She asked with her face a mask void of emotions. Melino thought she was good at appearing expressionless, but Hecate practically invented the look. You know he does not approve of any god or goddess entering one of the fields without his knowledge. He gets moodier than normal when someone goes behind his back within his domain. It's not as bad as his brothers, but it's still quite terrifying. As someone who could move between the domains of the big three, the goddess of magic was well versed with how each son of the Titan King ran their respective kingdoms and domains. The one thing they all had in common was their tempers when it came to people going behind their back. It was a headache for all involved. He doesn't. It's a matter not worth father's time. I don't want to bother him with something as meaningless as this, she replied, trying to dampen Hecate's curiosity. It won't take long. What does it involve? Hecate replied. Just stuff involving a silly little mortal, that's all. I think one might be trying to escape from Elysium? Why would any mortal soul be trying to escape from Elysium? Why do mortals try and do anything these days? They are so bizarre to understand in the modern world. They're nothing like they used to be back in the older days. Back in the time of swords and sandals. The goddess of magic didn't refute her claims. Mortals in recent years were very different from the ones that used to populate the earth. For instance, few believed in magic these days, resulting in a vast majority of the world's population to forget about her very existence. Most don't even know her name anymore. Only a loyal following of Wiccans, or wannabe modern witches as she called them, understood her importance in the world. The followers of Hecate ran all through the world centuries ago, but with the rise of the church and magic labeled as the work of the devil, magic was little more than a tool for fictional stories and the big screen movies. The Salem witch trials back in 1692 and 1693 didn't help either. Oh, and don't even get her started on those silly books from England. Hecate had some choice words for those books. The goddess tilted her head, observing the younger goddess with keen eyes. True enough. However, it must be more than that if the goddess of ghosts is seeing to it personally. Wouldn't this be a job more suited for Thanatos? It feels like a small-time problems he's better off solving. The god of death was notorious when it came to dead souls trying to find a way to escape the chains of the underworld. He often had dealings with souls trying to escape the fields of punishment and the fields of asphodel, but she couldn't recall the son of Nyx dealing with a soul trying to escape from Elysium. It was unusual. Melino huffed, and couldn't help but wonder why was Hecate making this harder than needed? Normally, she wouldn't care for such things. Hecate is like a lone wolf compared to the other gods. She does what she wants in her own time. Hecate didn't show any interest in much outside of what she deemed worthy or necessary. Her friendship with her parents allowed Melino to understand what the goddess was like, and what it took to hold her attention. The mystery revolving around Naruto Uzumaki was one she wanted to solve on her own, hence the reason she had not informed her father. If she told Hecate, she feared the information would undoubtedly end up back with Hades, given Hecate's position within Hades' small but trusted inner circle. There's no need. As I said, I can handle it. It won't take long. The goddess of magic crossed her arms. Perhaps I can accompany you then, and watch you at work. Melino shook her head. Your offer is kind, but there is no need. I can't help but feel like you're trying to get rid of me, Melino. I would never. Melino feigned surprise. The task at hand is simply not one that requires the attention of two goddesses. I can be the judge of that. Frowning, Melino inwardly sighed and resorted to a tactic she hated having to use. Anti-Hecate, don't you trust me? She stuck her lip out and widened her eyes in a way that made her look like a puppy. Gods, this was embarrassing. Hecate didn't say anything straight away, but when she did, her face gained a disapproving edge. Gods, Melino. Have some self-respect to lower yourself to such tactics. For shame. What? Before the goddess of ghosts could get another word out, Hecate threw up her hands. All right, all right. If you don't want to tell me what's going on, then I'll leave it alone. You better know what you're doing though. You know how your father gets when other gods mess around in his domain. I don't need to remind you about the syrup incident back in the 1950s, do I? It took 2 weeks to clean up, and to this day Styx will take shots as Hermes when he passes by. Hades was in a mood for months, and a pain in my ass. Hecate let out an uncharacteristic huff while crossing her arms. How Persephone put up with him I'll never know. This won't be like the syrup incident, I swear. She wasn't an idiot like her Olympian uncles. Hecate gave the younger goddess one final look before disappearing in a haze of smoke, leaving Melino alone once again. Finally, Melino muttered. She thought the goddess of magic was never going to leave. Gathering her bearings, Melino took a deep breath and started along the golden brick path, a firm expression on her face, beginning the investigation on the man known as Naruto Uzumaki. At the same time as Melino making her way to Elysium, the blonde shinobi was displaying another side of him the goddesses had yet to see. Who's a cutie? Who's a cutie? Is it you? I think it is. I think it is you. Naruto babbled, making funny faces and waving his hands in the air to entertain the little girl who sat in her mother's lap. The little girl kept looking his way when he passed the table, and it didn't take long for his attention to turn her way. She was such a cute baby. Blowing a raspberry at her, it didn't take long for the girl to fall into a fit of giggles, making babbling noises of her own, much to the blonde's delight and the mother's amusement. Clapping his hands in rhythm, the little girl copied his actions, her smile wide enough to show off her baby teeth. You're such a happy baby, aren't you? Yes, you are. Oh, that's such a lovely smile you have. It is, isn't it? The mother said, cradling her baby close and kissing the top of the head. She likes you. She gets fussy when she meets new people, but she seems to have taken to you immediately. You have a way with kids. It was the middle of the Friday afternoon, and he was quick to notice it was quieter than it usually was. Then again, the weather over the past couple of days had been awful, with nothing but gray clouds, rain, and the odd thunderstorm hitting the residents of New York. It was strange to see such a sudden change in the weather. 1 week prior, the sun had been out, and it was warm enough that Naruto hadn't needed to wear a coat. The woman he was serving walking in 15 minutes ago, bringing along the little sweetheart in her pushchair. The pulse coming from the little girl had caught his eye the moment she came inside with her mother. It was faint given her age, but he could feel the aura coming off her. It was the first one he sensed near himself since his arrival in New York. A demigod. He thought to himself, haven't met one of them in a few decades. Walking back over to the counter, he brought over a plate with a croissant sitting in the middle. Sitting on the side was a pot of jam and a dab of butter. He meant to bring it over moments earlier, but he got distracted by his new little friend, though the mother didn't seem to mind. Crouching to his knees, he started chuckling as he gently played with the little girl's hands when she reached out for him. I don't know about that. I think it's just a sign that she's going to be a very social person when she's older. He poked his tongue out at her and laughed harder when she copied him. I bet you're going to be a cheeky one too. Don't I know it? What her name? If you don't mind me asking. The young woman smiled. I don't mind. The other replied, gently bouncing the baby on one knee, this is Clarice, and I'm Aline. Aline LaRue. It's nice to meet you. He looked back at Clarice. Clarice, huh? That's a beautiful name. Both your names are French, right? Aline nodded, that's right. I named her after my grandmother, who was born in France, but moved to the United States in the 1940s after World War II ended after meeting my grandfather. You don't say? It sounds like there's a story there. The woman hummed, and gently placed Clarice back in the high chair Naruto set up for them when they first arrived. She started buttering her croissant when she continued, he was a soldier you see. Jonathan Tracy, originally from the state of Arizona and signed up to do his part when he was 20. He was part of the forces that dropped on the bays of Normandy, part of the second wave of troops that made their way up the beaches. He always told us it was a miracle he survived, but he'd lost some good friends that day. That day stayed with him until he passed a few years back. The blonde gained a look of sympathy. I'm sorry to hear that. He hadn't been there on the day, but he remembered seeing the aftermath of the Normandy landings. The world was a strange place, but after the Fourth Shinobi War had ended, Naruto believed he would never see war again in his lifetime. Looking back on it now, and looking at his situation, the number of wars taken place during his lifetime was countless. The unimaginable loss of innocent life from each war could populate the planet threefold. Even now after all these years, humanity still hadn't managed to make peace with itself, and abandon the concept of war for good. Was peace achievable? Because he didn't know any more. And they meet after the war. Aline shook her head. During the war. My grandmother was a nurse working with the French resistance. She met my grandfather after he got hit by a piece of shrapnel from a destroyed German panzer tank. It was this big and went straight through the abdomen. She held her hands out, and the space between was roughly the same length as the knife she was using. She tended to him and stayed with him until they could move him. After that, they were joined at the hip until he died. He even took her surname when they married. Naruto smiled. It sounds like a cliché movie romance. In a way. And then you named your daughter after her. I did. What did your partner have to say? He asked. Oh. Aline wiped her mouth, rubbing away a piece of jam from the corner of her lip. He didn't say anything. He's not in the picture. I see. I'm sorry to hear that. Don't be. It is what it is. The brown-haired woman shrugged. She didn't appear overly upset that her child's father wasn't in the picture. Then again, Clarice was a happy and healthy baby if their meeting was any indication, showing that Aline was doing a good job raising her daughter. She appeared to be a well-put-together woman and was taking her role as a mom seriously. There were plenty of women who sadly didn't take that role seriously in the modern world, but it was good to see Aline was not one of them. Becoming a mom was a surprise, but since Clarice came into my life, it was like a missing piece of a puzzle I didn't know existed was completed. You know what I mean? Yeah, I do. He knew that feeling all too well. When Hinata told him she was pregnant with Boruto, he'd scarcely believed it. He was in the middle of a bowl of ramen and promptly ended up choking on his noodles. He fell into a coughing fit afterwards for 5 minutes before gaining his bearings and turned to his wife. He remembered a lot of tears from both of them, which were followed by smiles and laughter. Afterwards, he picked Hinata up and spun her around their living room, eliciting a squeak of surprise from Hinata. All their friends had been delighted for them. Koji, Ino, and Kiba even started to cry, though the latter vehemently denied the accusation. Telling Hayashia had been nerve-wracking. Things between them were on good ground, but the blonde remembered what Hayashi was like during their childhood, and old habits didn't disappear quickly. He needn't have been worried. The elder Hyuga embraced his daughter with tears of happiness in his eyes, before following it up by embracing Naruto. He never saw Hayashi happier than the day they told him he was going to be grandfather, a role he lived for when Boruto and Himawari were born. And then the day came when Boruto was born, and he could say with his hand on his heart, he was never more nervous than that night. They were in bed when Hinata's water had broke. He nearly took the front door off when they headed for the hospital. When they arrived, he'd been in a panic, while Hinata was as cool as a cucumber. She was the one keeping him calm throughout the ordeal, which was a testament to her strength. There is no need to panic. We've spent 9 months preparing for this moment. We've got this. Her word rang through his mind. She's been right, as always, and suffice to say, Hinata kicked childbirth's ass. Even Shizune, who had been present at hundreds, if not thousands of births, complimented Hinata on how she handled it. All he could do was stand by her side, take her hand and lend his strength to his wife. Boruto's birth had taken nearly 6 hours, but the moment he arrived and Shizune placed him in Hinata's arms, it was like the world stood still. He was tiny. Little tufts of blonde hair sat atop his head, showing everyone his lungs were working as they should be. They both cried, and before long, Hinata passed their son over to him. Despite practicing with a watermelon for months, Naruto still felt unready as their son sat in his arms, maneuvering his arms into the correct position. Then, as if feeling his father's insecurities, Boruto opened his tiny eyes, revealing a stunning set of blue eyes brighter than his own. At that moment, it felt like his body lifted from the earth. It could be different for other people, but for Naruto, that moment it was as if his reason for existing was to co-create this precious life sitting in his arms. Like his sole purpose in the world wasn't to be the Hokage of the Hidden Leaf Village, nor was it to be the person who ended the Fourth Shinobi War. It was to be the father of this little boy. He wondered if this was how his parents felt the moment he was born. When Himawari was born, it was a similar feeling. His little girl had been the apple of his eye, and so much like his darling wife. She was always helping everyone and taking care of them. Looking at Clarice and playing with the little girl, he couldn't help but think back to all the times he played with her when she was that age. Are you okay? Blinking in surprise, he looked up at Aline. She was looking at him in concern. You're crying. I am what? Bringing his hand up to his face, he found the woman to be correct and felt the wet patches around his eyes and his skin stretching in the corner of his eyes. I didn't even notice. When did that start to happen? He was so wrapped up in the memories of his children that he didn't notice his emotions beginning to get the better of him. Grabbing one of the unused napkins on the table, he turned away and dabbed his eyes. I am fine. He replied, I don't know what came over me. How unprofessional of me. Aline shook her head, and her expression bore no ill will. Don't be. It's not my place to ask what caused this, but I hope you're okay. Not wanting the attention, Naruto waved it off. I'm fine. I'm not sure what that was, but I'm okay. To his relief, a table off in the corner was trying to get his attention, and provided a much-needed distraction. If you'll excuse me. He glanced down at Clarice and gave the little girl one last smile and raspberry before making his way across the room. Of course. Aline watched him go, her dark eyes following his back as he wove his way past the tables. She wouldn't pry, but she didn't believe it was nothing. Feeling Clarice beginning to fuss, she looked down and couldn't herself from smiling when she saw Clarice reaching out to him, a pouty expression on her face. Her daughter was taken with the blonde man and in an adorable way. He was warm and gave off a kind aura that was comforting to be around. Sadly, she couldn't say the same for that idiot god who fathered her daughter. The god of war, Ares, lived up to his namesake. Damn, she had a habit for falling for the bad boys. She never intended to end up sleeping with and get knocked up by a Greek god of all people, but a couple of beers and a few shots of tequila, and boom. Instant baby. The god of war didn't even bother to stick around in the morning, and only bothered to visit her after Clarice was born to inform her of his identity and the challenges Clarice would face one day. He held Clarice once, and their daughter had screamed her head off. She couldn't blame her. His aura was the opposite of the blonde barista. Thankfully, Ares didn't frequent Arizona much, and they were only in New York to visit her mom. Suffice to say, Clarice's father had yet to make an appearance if he ever did. Shaking her baby daddy out of head, Aline found herself laughing when she spied Clarice reaching for the jam. The little girl looked determined to reach the sweet condiment, though it turned to annoyance when her mother pulled it away. She looks a lot like her father when she's annoyed. Aline could only hope that was all she picked up. Underworld. The goddess of ghosts let out a low huff as she looked out across the never-ending neighborhoods that covered Elysium. Up until this point, Melino had a plan to follow the emotional threads from Naruto Uzumaki and see where it took her. She would confront his loved ones and gather what information she could to unravel the mystery that surrounded him. However, Elysium, like its two other havens for mortal souls, was never-ending, and technically expanded forever as more and more souls filled its valleys. Now that she was within its walls, Melino could safely teleport herself across the valley and towards her goal. She couldn't do so before thanks to the enchantment placed around the valley by Hades and Hecate, which stopped anyone from teleporting in and out from Elysium as they pleased. If someone wanted to visit or leave, they had to walk through the golden gates. Even her father abided by that rule. It was purely for security purposes, but it was still a little annoying. Where to start? She said to herself, standing by the entrance and crossing her arms over her chest. Let's check the map. With Elysium as never-ending as it was, the Lord of the Underworld came up with the idea to set up a map point after entering through the gate. She remembered the conversation well, her father informing her and her mother of his decision over dinner on the veranda overlooking her mother's garden. He seemed proud of the idea but got defensive when the pair questioned him on why he was making this decision now of all times. Then she remembered the Queen of the Underworld had dragged her husband to the most god-forsaken place known to both humans and gods alike. Disneyland. The idea that her father, the man that invented brooding, spent the day at the happiest place in the world was comical to imagine. Sadly, there were no pictures. Hades ensured to burn them all before returning. He wasn't going to allow any evidence of the visit becoming public knowledge. The last thing he needed was his younger brothers or the rest of Zeus's brood finding out about it. Still, Melino was aware amusement parks like Disneyland had maps detailing the entire park on every street and corner and was positive that's where her father got the idea. Also, Melino couldn't help noticing the distinct sound of the song, "It's a Small World," coming from the Fields of Punishment. She didn't envy those poor souls. Whoever created that damn song deserved 1,000 lashings courtesy of Alecto and the Furies. The map was sat in the center of a courtyard as you walked through the golden gates, a fountain built behind it with beautiful water features shaped like animals jumping out of the water. The map was enormous, twice her size and built inside a frame of solid gold. With new souls entering Elysium daily, Elysium divided into sections. Each section resembled the very best of the living conditions from that era along with additional perks. There was ancient Greece, ancient Rome, medieval, Victorian, Renaissance, just to name a few. Biting her lip, Melino couldn't stop herself from shaking her head. None of those felt right. Her eyes initially lingered on ancient Rome and Greece, with the two being among the oldest within Elysium. In her mind, his emotional threads to the dead couldn't have gone any further than ancient Greece, since it housed the souls that first entered the underworld under her father's reign and jurisdiction. Well, that's not entirely true. Her gaze shifted from ancient Greece and slowly turned to another section on the opposite end of the map. There was one area that predated ancient Greece by a sizable amount of time. How long those souls had rested in the underworld was questionable. When Hades came to power alongside his brothers and divided up the sky, sea, and underworld amongst themselves, it had taken the eldest son of Cronus decades to wade through everything that waited for him. The underworld, for lack of a better phrase, was a mess when he first arrived. Before the time of the Olympians, the Titans ruled the world. At that time, the underworld was presided over by Iapetus, the fifth son of Gaia and Ouranos, and the Titan of mortality, pain, and violent death, and the Lord of the West. Although given the duty of watching over the underworld as a type of warden for his brother and king, Iapetus shirked his duties and looked at it as little more than a bothersome responsibility. He rarely visited the realm of the dead, and on the rare occasion he did descend to the lower world, he would lie to his brother about the state it was in. In his reports, he would tell the Titan King the underworld was doing great, and the younger brother had no reason not to trust his loyal brother. In reality, the underworld was in pieces. The souls of the dead wandered from corner to corner for eternity, monsters did as they pleased, and the Furies each ruled a corner of the underworld with dozens of lesser creatures at their disposal. The warden had lost control, and the asylum now belonged to the inmates. Then the underworld was taken over by Hades, and the eldest son of the Titan King took one look at the lower world and decided a change was in order. He decided he needed to put his stamp on his new domain, and he did just that. He brought the Furies under his will and struck fear into the monsters that lived within the underworld. He placed Thanatos as his right hand, and with the god of death in his service, there was no one else that could refute his claim over the domain. When Elysium, the fields of punishment, and the asphodel fields came to be, he ferried the first batch of souls to their rightful homes. Some resisted, in particular, those that belonged to the fields of punishment. However, information about the first batch of souls was the knowledge that Melino didn't have. If she had to guess, the souls belonged to the mortals that predated the Olympians. The first batch of mortals created by Gaia during the Golden Age. Hades never spoke about them, and neither did her mother. It was bizarre to think some mortals predated her father. When she asked questions about them, all he did was frown. Could they be the answer? The old souls, huh? The voice came from over her shoulder, freezing Melino in her place. Slowly, the goddess swiveled her focus until she found herself staring into familiar green eyes. Hey! Biwa! Melino yelped, jumping back a couple of steps. Hecate! What are you doing here? The goddess of magic shrugged. A nonchalant expression was on her face, though her lips were twitching into a cheeky smile. I followed you. Oh, yeah. No shit. Why did you follow me? How did you follow me? How? Melino, I'm an old goddess. Older than you, and older than your parents. I still have some tricks up my sleeves. She revealed, serving to annoy the younger immortal. Hecate had this bad habit of popping up when you least expected. Case in point, the situation Melino was now experiencing. Back to the matter. You're looking at the old souls. Why? Would you believe me if I said curiosity? No, I don't think I would believe you. She replied in a matter-of-fact tone. I didn't think so, she replied with a sigh. She could feel a headache coming on. You're not going to leave me alone until I tell you, are you? When the gods of magic saw something that caught her attention, she was just like every other goddess attached to their pantheon. She had to know, and she had to have it. It was universal with their family. Crossing her arms, Hecate gave Melino a look that few could go up against. Correct, so you may as well tell me why you're suddenly interested in the old souls. Souls that predate the Olympians, and are among the first group of mortals to walk this world. Souls, in which Lord Hades does not talk about with anyone. Souls that are off limits to everyone, and I do mean everyone. Hecate put plenty of emphasis on the final word for Melino to notice. Neither spoke for a good minute, but when Hecate's gaze remained stonily calm and focused, Melino couldn't do anything but relent. How could she hold such a straight face for so long? It was honestly a complete mystery to her. Fine, I'll tell you, but I'm saying it once, so you better pay close attention. And don't go and tattle on me to father. Very well. Now, please explain why you are here. Explain she did, and she told the older immortal everything she knew, including the parts that weren't as important. Hecate didn't react with lively expressions like some gods and goddesses they knew, but one hand did come up and gently rest against her chin in an Athena-like manner. She didn't interrupt, merely listening to the information Melino had to give, only reacting with gentle head nods. After Melino finished, a twinkle in those emerald eyes of hers told Melino enough. Her curiosity was piqued, and Melino had a feeling she wouldn't be journeying through Elysium alone anymore. How interesting. I think I'll join you. And there it is. She thought. She hadn't planned to have company on this excursion of hers. However, out of all the immortals she knew, Hecate was one of the more tolerable to be around. Some like her divine uncles, namely Apollo, or Ares, would make her want to rip her hair out if left alone with them. The goddesses weren't as bad, but ones like Athena, talking about mind-numbing trivia all that time, sounded like nails on a chalkboard. If it had to be anyone, she could have done far worse than the goddess of magic. I thought as much. She sighed again, sounding like a child who had their Saturday afternoon ruined. Come on. Let's get going. Lead the way. The pair of goddesses left the map of Elysium, briefly looking at the dozens of paths that branched off to the different sections before the goddess of ghosts led them down the one that led to the Old Souls. The area was named the Old World, an apt name given the status of its residents. Melino didn't want to say it aloud, but she had no idea what was waiting for them at the other end. It was unknown to her, but she couldn't resist the temptation of her curiosity bubbling up in her stomach. All she could hope for was to get some answers before her father realized where she was and dragged her back. 2 in 1 day. Another demigod, Naruto thought, finishing up serving a customer as he turned to the entrance as the door was pushed open. Like earlier with Aline and Clarice, a woman and her daughter walked into the fox's den, though the daughter was noticeably older. If he had to guess, the girl was around 4 or 5 years of age. She had dark hair down to her chin, and a row of freckles splashed across her nose, adding an extra dose of adorable. Visibly, she didn't favor the woman much, who had long light blonde hair falling to the middle of her back and sharp features. Even their eyes, though blue, the little girl's were much darker. If he had to compare the shades, the woman's were a pale blue like the sky. The girl's though were the same shade of blue as a Chidori. Like Clarice, he could sense the aura around her. She was a demigod for sure, and the pulse coming off her was more potent. If Clarice was a splash in the pond, then this girl's was reminiscent of someone cannonballing in the swimming pool. Prepared to walk over, he stopped and stared for a second at the way the woman was moving her body. There was a stagger in her step, and every time one foot went forward, she tilted to one side. It was like watching a seesaw, and her body couldn't decide which way to go. For a brief moment, he watched her steady herself with the help of the little girl. Welcome to the fox's den. Please he started, but halted momentarily as his nose wrinkled. The smell of alcohol clung to the woman like a second skin. It was strong. So strong that he visibly recoiled as it overloaded his sense of smell. Whether or not the woman noticed, she didn't give any indication. However, it confirmed his thoughts. She's drunk. He tried not to frown and kept a smile on his face. Looking at her face, he saw traces of mascara sloppily rubbed away, leaving dark patches on her otherwise clear skin. Please, let me show you to a table. He ushered them to the closest table and brought out the chair for the woman to sit on. Whether the woman was aware of what was going on, he wasn't sure, but the moment she sat on the chair, she slumped forward. Her face buried itself in her hands, strands of hair woven through her fingers and nails pinching against her skin. Luckily the room only had half a dozen customers, but those still here looked their way when muffled sobs broke out of the woman. Her daughter sat in the other chair and put her knees up to her chin. She just stared at her mother with those big blue eyes. The woman, for whatever the reason, was not in the right mindset. He didn't know what had caused this woman to end up this way, but maybe he could help her in some way. Pocketing his notebook and pen, he crouched down to the woman's level, gentle asking, "Ma'am? Are you okay?" Whether she heard him or not, she gave no indication. Her muffled sobs only continued as he waited for an answer. "Ma'am? Do you know where you are?" Again she didn't say anything. "Ma'am, my name's Naruto Uzumaki. I own the cafe you've entered, and I'm worried about your current state. Is there anyone I can call for you?" Again, there was no response but her sobs. He tried for 5 minutes, to which, half the people in the room got up and left the room. They must have found the situation too uncomfortable to bear, but he paid them no notice. Seeing he wasn't getting an answer from the parent, he tried his luck with the child. Maybe she knew what was going on. Shuffling across the table, he crouched a couple of feet away from the little girl and smiled at her to show it was okay. At first, the little girl did nothing but hide her face in her knees. She was a shy little thing, though he could see her peeking at him from the corner of her eyes. One of her hands came up and played with one of her hair clips decorating her hair. She was a little cutie. "Hi honey," he greeted, trying to use sweet words to show her he could be trusted. "My name's Naruto, and I work here." He motioned with his arms to the interior. "Do you know what's wrong with your mommy?" She didn't say anything, but he did get a little nod from her. "Can you tell me? I'd like to help." She raised her head ever so slightly. He could just about make out her mouth. Help. That's right." He edged a little closer, looking between the girl and her sobbing mother. "Did something bad happen to make her sad?" Again, the girl nodded. "Can you tell me?" As he spoke to the little girl, the remaining customers slowly filtered out of the room. Some ignored the situation in front of them, while one did show some sympathy and mouth if he needed help. He responded with a soft shake of his head, though he did mouth back a thank you for their consideration. After the last person left, he quickly got up and spun the open sign to close before returning to the little girl's side. Her face scrunched up. "Mommy wanted to see Daddy." Naruto didn't react, and instead softly nodded. "I see," he replied. Thinking over her words, he rubbed his chin. She wanted to see Daddy, which meant she tried to see him but possibly was unable to. If that was the case, then a sticky situation was forming in front of him. If his senses about the little girl were correct, which he knew they were, then this woman had tried to visit her divine partner. He was aware that there were rules set in place by the divine ones. One of those rules, when it came to the children, enforced they had to be raised by the mortal parent. The immortal parent had minor, possibly zero contact with the child. The ones he knew and spent some time with in the past had a similar rule in place, though they watched over their children in secret. For the rest of them out in the world, he couldn't say what rules they had in place, but if he was a betting man, the topic of demigods was likely universal. He returned his attention to the little girl. "You didn't get to see him." This time, she shook her head. "The man wouldn't let us." "The man?" "The man in the big building." Before he could ask what building she meant, she turned in her seat and pointed to a picture of the New York skyline he put up a few weeks back. Following her finger, his gaze settled on the most iconic building in New York. The Empire State Building. So that's where they live, he thought. He had a feeling that was the case ever since he first sensed the energy that radiated from that building. If he could describe it in one way, it was like a never-ending pulse of invisible energy that few in the world could sense. It was a commanding presence. Like it wanted everyone who could sense such things to know they were there. The immortals ones of the world vary. At least, the ones he met anyway. Some kept it under wrap, and others liked to boast and brag. He didn't need to guess what kind lived at the Empire State Building, not to mention, given the regular that visit, which pantheon they belong to. "He said he loved me." He heard and leaned into the sobbing woman. She repeated the same ling over and over again, each with an equal amount of anger and sadness. A scenario was beginning to form in his head and turned to look at the sobbing woman. Her daughter sat quietly next to her. Her gaze flickered between her mother and himself. Gently slapping his cheeks, he decided to try and help in whatever limited way he could. A new smile etching over his face, he asked the little girl a question. "What's your name?" "Thalia," she replied, a murmur in her voice. "Well, Thalia, have you ever had a milkshake before?" The little girl blinked. A little unsteadily, she nodded her head and tilted her head to the side. She was too cute. "Well, I happen to be very good at making sweeties and drinks," he replied. "I'm going to get your mom a warm drink to help her feel better. Would you like a milkshake?" "A chocolate milkshake." The word chocolate immediately sparked the girl's interest. Her whole body straightened, and her lips formed a tiny O shape. Instead of answering, she nodded her head a little more vigorously than before. The wonders of chocolate never ceased. Okay, I'll get right on that, he replied, before turning back to the sobbing mother. Ma'am, I'm going to get you some water and some food to absorb the alcohol in your system. She didn't answer him back, and nor did he think she would. Standing up, he rubbed the back of his head. What a weird day this was turning out to be. The moment he turned around and headed for the counter, his body stopped when the sound of gagging filled the room, followed by the dreaded sound of vomit hitting the floor. He twisted around, noticing Thalia was no longer in her chair and was now next to her mother. His face scrunched up into a scowl as the woman tried to push her daughter away, a nasty glare forming on the woman. Get away from me! Mama! I said, get away from me! A harder shove pushed the girl back a couple of feet and sent her sprawling on the floor. Naruto was there in a second, cathing the visibly upset Thalia and leveling her mother with a harsh glare. Hey! He said, watching the woman turn away and put her back to him, I don't care what state you're in, you don't harm your child. Thalia sniffled, and the blonde could sense the waterworks beginning to appear. To his mild surprise, he watched her shuffled until she was hidden behind his right leg, her tiny hands clutching at the fabric of his pants. Gently patting her head, he shushed her sweetly, it's okay. I'm sure your mom didn't mean it. Thump. He threw his head back and groaned. The wreck of a woman and mother of the little girl clutching his leg for comfort fell forward, narrowly avoiding hitting another table and slumped to the ground in her vomit. Heading over to check on her, he crouched on her side and found her out like a light. The day's events, coupled with the booze and heightened emotions, proved too much for her. Great, he mumbled, rolling the woman over on his back. He took off his apron and rolled it up into a ball and stuck it beneath the woman's head. Rubbing his hand over his face, he looked back at the little girl, the latter of whom was shuffling idly from side to side. Her face was all scrunched up and a sniffling. Despite the situation he was in, he put on the brightest smile he could and shuffled over to her. Mama's just fallen asleep. Mommy and daddies can be silly like that sometimes. She didn't reply. Instead, she continued to sniffle. He raised his hand and gently patted her on top of her head. What more could he do right now? I think it's safe to say I won't be opening for the rest of the day, he thought, before doing his best to comfort the upset little girl. Back in Elysium, the goddess of magic and the goddess of ghosts found themselves standing at their destination. This is not what I expected, Hecate muttered, standing to the left of Melino, and letting her green eyes travel across her surroundings. They stood in the middle of the gates that led into the lands of the old souls, looking out at the distinct architecture often found with Eastern civilization of old. It expanded as far as they could see. The gates themselves were impressive to look at, comprised of 2 iron gates a couple of feet thick with a symbol written on the surface in gold. The 2 halves of the symbol sat on each side of the gate. It took a moment for the older immortal to recognize it. It's a kanji. A kanji. Melino replied, a frown on her face, as in those funky letter things they use in the East. Hecate scoffed at the description but gave a subtle nod. That's right. It's a form of writing comprised of a system of symbols that represent words or ideas, and that can have different meanings and pronunciations depending on their context. It's an old form of written language. How old though is often up for debate. To find them down here though is most odd. All right, so what does this one mean? Melino didn't get an answer right away. She could see the cogs working within Hecate's mind, her index finger and thumb pinching her perfect skin on her brow. I could be wrong, the older immortal said. I never spent much time in the East in my long life, but I did take it upon myself to familiarize myself with some of the languages. Some of my past lovers of whom were from the East wrote in such language, you see. The goddess of ghosts made a gagging noise. Hecate shot her a look, but continued, if I'm right, then the kanji written on the gates is the word, shinobi. Shinobi? Isn't that another word for ninja? The dark-haired goddess rose a perfect eyebrow. Are you telling the souls of ninjas are the ones living here? The older goddess shrugged. How am I supposed to know? I've never been here before, just like you. That's what the kanji reads. Fine, fine. Waving her hands in the air, she turned around and looked out at the expanse that made up this part of Elysium. Dense forest populated the area with the tops a shade of green that would have made Pan groan in delight from how healthy they looked. Small mountains dotted a few parts, and from where they stood, they could have sworn they saw tiny dots moving up the side like birds. Dirt roads wove through the lands connecting small villages and towns in various parts of the area. It appeared idyllic to nature lovers. I guess we should follow the closest thread and see where it takes us. And where might that be? Humming to herself as she focused on the threads of Naruto's emotional ties, she soon pointed down one of the dirt roads leading to one of the towns. That way. A particularly strong thread is emanating down that path. I suggest we start with that one. Nothing more needed to be said as the two immortals turned in that direction and headed along the path. They fell into silence, one with a determined expression on her face, while the other stared at her in mild curiosity. The goddess of magic spent most of her time in underworld thanks to her friendship with its lord and his wife. She felt more at ease and at peace in the shadows of the lower world than basking in the light of Olympus. The company was better and didn't force her to socialize with people she couldn't stomach. Not to mention, it was nice not having to deal with gods trying to woo her into their temples. A certain sky god had a habit of trying to wiggle his eyebrows her way. That wasn't happening. Not now, and not ever. She didn't desire to be a notch on his belt, nor did she want a vengeful queen turning her eye on her. However, in all her time spent in the underworld, this was the first time she'd seen Melino this determined. Melino resembled Persephone, but her personality was too much like Hades most of the time, skulking in the shadows and the dark corners of the underworld. Seeing the younger immortal sparked something inside Hecate that forced her to find out what was going on, and so far, she hadn't been disappointed. A mysterious mortal with ties to souls that predate the Olympians? Yes, please. As the mortals would say, Christmas had come early. This is where it stops. Melino's voice rang out, forcing Hecate from her thoughts and looking at their destination. Here. She sounded skeptical. You're positive about that? Hey. I swear this is where it stops. Coming to a stop, Hecate and Melino found themselves staring at a moderately sized building with a large sliding door made of wooden panels. A thick wall ran on both sides before meeting in the middle, dividing into two. When they were walking closer to the area, there was a distinct shift in the temperature. Now, they understood why. A hot springs. You didn't see many of those in the underworld. The only thing vaguely similar was Hades' hot tub, though only he and his wife were permitted to use it. To each their own, I guess. Maybe these were big back when the old souls were alive. Melino shrugged, not having a better answer. I guess. Hecate looked around. She didn't see many souls around, though she could hear a mixture of men and women talking on the other side of the building. Though on a mission, Hecate couldn't help but feel tempted to walk through and indulge with what the hot springs had to offer. The number of times she participated in a hot spring was few, though each time she felt relaxed and rejuvenated. Perhaps she could convince Melino to set aside her quest for knowledge for an hour or two. Puffed. Both women blinked. Did you hear that? Like someone was giggling. I heard it. Though, where did it come from? Both looked around but saw no one nearby. Puffed. There it is again, Melino muttered. A frown washed over her face and found herself following after the sound with Hecate hot on her heels. They turned the corner away from the entrance and walked against the large wooden wall that separated them from the hot springs. The path was short, but it did lead them into a small wooded area that rested against the bottom of the establishment. They could feel the steam tickling against their skin. As wonderful as it must have been, they weren't here for that. Ow! That branch hit my face. Then try and duck out the way next time. Pushing against some tall bushes with Melino narrowly avoiding another branch to the face, the two goddesses found themselves staring at the back of a fairly large man crouched on his knees with one eye pressed against the fence. A laugh, or a giggle, they weren't sure which, erupted from the man's mouth and didn't appear to notice they were there. The way he laughed, it felt wrong to them. Like he was laughing over something that the pair of them wouldn't agree with or tolerate. It felt wrong. Tilting their heads and tiptoeing to either side of him, they got a good look at the man. The first thing noticeable about the man was his long and shaggy white hair tied into a ponytail that reached his lower back with two shoulder-length bangs framing his face. On his cheeks, they spied red markings going down his cheek emanating from the bottom of his eyes with a small wart of the side of his nose. His clothes were most bizarre and served to help the goddesses in believing the old souls lived in a society similar to the eastern parts of the world they knew. He wore a green short shirt kimono and matching pants, under which he wore mesh armor that is visible at his wrists. He also wore handguards, a black belt, traditional Japanese wooden sandals, and a red haori with 2 yellow circles on each side. It was a unique look that neither goddesses had seen before. Some kind of warrior? Hecate wondered. Excuse me, but what are you doing? Melino's voice rang out, crossing her arms and frowning down at the soul. To both their surprise, he didn't turn around, but he did wave a hand in the air. SSHH, quiet kid. Can't you see I'm busy? Between him and Fence, they noticed a small notebook settled down on the grass with a pen resting between the pages. Busy? Doing what? Research. What else? The two immortals looked at each other before Hecate replied, research. Yeah, so if you could scray and dash, he started, turning his head for a brief moment, revealing a small hole in the fence. He was mid-sentence when his jaw dropped, his dark eyes gazing over the forms of the two immortals. It only lasted a moment before a gaga-like expression washed over his face, turning his whole body to face them. Hot mama. You are two smoking babes. Both goddesses blinked, though a pair of scowls quickly appeared on their faces. Excuse me. What did you call me? The latter who spoke was Hecate, who looked at the white-haired man with sudden intensity. She did not take kindly to being called a babe. A funny look washed over the man's face. His hands came up and wiggled in the air, a dust of red appeared on his cheeks. If the goddesses were honest, the look he was giving them gave them the creeps. It was like he was looking through their clothes and ogling them like a piece of meat. Didn't he know who they were? Oh man, I haven't seen you two around here before. You must be new, which is weird because we haven't had new people in a very long time. He replied, taking a step towards them, but hey. You won't hear me complaining. If you don't cease these vile words, I will carve you into tiny pieces. Hey. Hey. There's nothing wrong with appreciating a good-looking woman. There is when you look at them like that. Hecate stormed forward. It was rare to see her angry. Usually, the older goddess kept her feelings bottled up inside. However, that was not the case with this man. Melino couldn't disagree. The man's behavior irked her. What are you looking at through that hole? Wait. Don't look dash. His words went unanswered as Hecate lowered herself and peeped through the hole in the fence. Watching her from behind, she glared at the man when she caught him staring at Hecate's bottom. She kept a close eye on those wandering hands too. Whatever was on the other side of the fence, it made Hecate go still. She could have sworn she was muttering something underneath her breath. A moment later, a red-faced but angry-looking Hecate leveled him with a glare that would have made Zeus shiver. You, she started, her arms shaking at her side. Her eyes shined, and Melino could have sworn she felt the ground shake beneath them. You vile pervert. A spear appeared in Hecate's hands and pointed it at the white-haired man, who started nervously laughing. Pushing her way through the goddess and the spirit, Melino lowered herself and looked through the hole in the fence. What had gotten Hecate so angry? Oh. She quickly understood. On the other side of the fence was one of the hot springs. In particular, the female side of the hot springs. Dotted all over the pool, Melino spied at least 24 women, all of whom looked as if they were spawn of the love goddess. Some were basking in the water with just their heads and neck visible, and others had their legs dipped in partway while accumulating a healthy sweat on the top half. Either way, it left nothing to the imagination and basked the man in all the beautiful curves these women had to offer. After a moment of looking through the peephole, Melino stood up and spun around with an eerily calm look on her face. Her eyes though told a different story as she looked at the man accusingly. Pervert. Hey. I resent that term. Then what the hell are you? To their surprise, the man laughed and wiggled his fingers in the air. I'm a big one. Melino huffed, wanting to walk away from this man and never see him again as Hecate pointed her spear closer to his face. Unfortunately, to her dismay, she felt a tug in her gut towards the white-haired man. Her face dropped, praying to whoever it was the gods prayed to in these situations but found them unanswered. The emotional ties that came from Naruto Uzumaki were thrumming stronger than before. It was like a heartbeat getting stronger. As much as she didn't want to believe it, she was 100% sure this awful man in front of her was the one it was connected to. Hecate. What is it? The goddess's emerald eyes never left the man as she kept her weapon inches away from his face. She didn't dare look away from those wandering hands. He's the one. The one. Melino gave her a look. You have to be kidding me. I wish I was. But him. I know. I don't like it either. I mean, look at him. There's no mistake? It's not someone on the other side of the fence. I wish it was, but sadly we're stuck with this fiend to women everywhere. I'm still here, you know. The man said, a defeated and annoyed look plastered on his face. His shoulders slumped forward and hung his arms loosely by his side. His lip pouted outwards like a temperamental child. Don't remind us, Melino replied with an annoyed expression. Why did she have such bad luck? It was supposed to be a simple mission to gather information. Look. I'm going to set aside what we caught you doing just now if you answer some questions of ours. The man's eyebrow rose. What kind of questions? Well, to start with, you should know my name is Melino, goddess of ghosts and daughter of Hades, the lord and ruler of the underworld. She announced, pride evident in her tone, and watched the man's eyebrows raise higher by the second. The woman holding the spear inches from your face is Hecate, goddess of magic. It would be wise not to do anything rash, or she will poke you full of holes. You're goddesses. The man stuttered out. His back pressed against the wall. We are, and we have questions for you. What kind of questions? Melino smirked. Finally, some answers. Anything and everything about your relationship with Naruto Uzumaki. The second his name left Melino's mouth she felt a shift from the man. It was quick, but both goddesses saw his fearful expression change to serious. It was as if a different person suddenly stood in front of them. He stood taller, and it felt like his shoulders widened. Before Hecate could react, she was left wide-eyed when her spear was knocked from her hands, and caught mid-air by the man. He spun it around a few times, a whistle in the air before embedding the tip into the earth. Both goddesses were silent at the sudden movement, neither expecting it. What the dash? So the Gaki's still up there, huh? The white-haired man closed his eyes and a small smile appeared. His words caught them off guard, though Melino did take one uneasy step forward. I take then you know who we're talking about. His eyes opened. He still appeared serious, though neither could say he looked hostile. Merely prepared should they try something. Girlie, I dare you to find someone in this neck of the woods who doesn't know the name, Naruto Uzumaki, he replied, crossing his arms over his chest and leaning back against the wood with one foot pressed on the fence. He mumbled something under his breath, though they could have sworn he said, Kushina and Tsunade will be pleased to get news of him. This time, it was Melino who stood straighter, and put her trepidation to one side. Then who are you to him? Your emotional bond and ties to him are strong. That's how we were able to locate you. Is that right? That's right. A silly grin made its way onto his face. Well. It's nice to know the Gaki still thinks about me after all this time. I swear, that kid knows how to worry me to death, even when I'm dead. He looked into their dark and emerald-colored eyes. Is he doing okay? I've never met him, Hecate replied, a little off-put at how easily he disarmed her. I've only met him once, but he was kind. I've wanted to know more about him since I met him. Melino answered honestly. She wanted some answers. She could only hope this man was willing to give some. What can you tell us about him? What can I tell you? He replied, a snort coming from him. I could tell you everything about him if I wanted to. One hand broke from his crossed arms, and poked his thumb to his chest. The name's Jiraiya, and I'm that blonde knucklehead's godfather. Nice to meet you, ladies. Chapter 10, Part 10. Underworld. Where is he taking us? Melino whispered, falling into step beside Hecate. The two goddesses walked side by side, about 2 meters behind Jiraiya as the man led them away from the hot springs. He hasn't said much since he told us who he was. What do you make of all this? Next to her, the eyes of the green goddess remained firmly on the back of their new acquaintance. She was still uneasy at how easily he took her spear from her hands. Never had a mortal or an immortal disarmed her in such quick fashion. The man was a skilled warrior, but to what degree, she was still unsure. It's hard to say, Hecate replied. One moment this man is ogling naked women through a peephole in the fence of a hot spring. The next thing we know, his whole facade of a pervert disappears, and this serious personality appears. You don't think he's a pervert? Or a big one, as he puts it. Oh, I think he is a pervert. However, there's more to him than that. She added, almost like it's a mask to draw someone to assess them with the hidden personality behind what you see. As Melino mentioned, the man hadn't told them much since the reveal earlier. After the reveal of being Naruto's godfather, he went a step further and added that he was also the blonde's mentor. A mentor in what? They didn't know. He stopped there and told them to follow him if they wanted answers. So they did, and they could only hope they didn't regret that decision. You know, both turned their heads and looked at Jiraiya. The white-haired spirit was looking at them from the corner of his eye, amusement clear for all to see. You two aren't being quiet. I can hear you. Melino crossed hers as they walked. Well, it wasn't like we trying to hide anything. Besides, don't you know it's rude to eavesdrop on someone's conversation? A bark of laughter escaped from the man. I would, but after years of intel gathering and listening into people's conversation, I've developed acute hearing whether I like it or not. A snort broke from the goddess of ghosts. Are you going to tell us where we're going yet? Now, Jiraiya replied, making small gestures with his hands. Don't worry about a thing. We haven't got long to go. A couple more minutes and we'll be there. And where are we going? You haven't given us any information. The white-haired spirit simply told them to follow him if they wanted to learn about Naruto Uzumaki. Though both were cautious about where he was planning on taking them, Melino wanted answers. She was close to getting them, and if it meant following this perverted man, then so be it. Hecate, meanwhile, wasn't going to let Melino go too far over the line. What they were doing right now, making conversation with the spirits of the dead without the consent of Hades, was a big no-no. Not to mention, they were in a part of the underworld that was off limits to everyone. If the Natos came flying overhead and spotted them, then it was game over for their little adventure. He would go to Hades, and the Lord of the Underworld would drag them back willing or unwilling. She'd seen Hades when he got angry. No thanks. She didn't want to experience his anger directed at her. Sure, Melino would get disciplined in some way. Hades would surely get creative with her punishment, and Persephone would throw her 2 drachmas into the matter. The queen of the underworld liked to stay involved in that way, despite being stuck on the surface. But for Hecate, she could see Hades concocting something special for her. In a sense, she was enabling Melino to go on this little quest of hers. She caught her red-handed and chose to help her rather than convince her not to go ahead with her plan. Don't worry. Don't get your panties in a bunch over little details. What did you say? He spun his head around, giving them a view of his face. Jiraiya frowned with his lips pouting forward. You know, for a pair of goddesses, you're not nearly as fun as I thought you'd be. You take everything so personally. His hands came up and rested behind the back of his head. There was a jovial step to his walk. You know, this is the first time I think a goddess like yourself has ever come all this way to our little slice of paradise. At least, since we all first moved in. Man, that was a long time ago. So, you have met another god before? Melino asked. Jiraiya nodded. Oh yeah, for sure. As I said, it was a long time ago. I remember when this place uses to be a big bowl of chaos. You couldn't tell which way was left or right, or up and down. You used to have to go with the flow and all that. Both immortals nodded. His words confirmed what they initially knew about the time frame of the old souls. You talk about the time the underworld was under the watch of the Titan, Iapetus. A time when the souls of the dead ran rampant over the underworld. The white-haired man shrugged. I guess. I don't know anyone by that name. Then again, that proves the guy didn't do his job of running the show. All I remembered is one day, some big guy in a helmet appeared one day and started judging us by the good and bad deeds in our lives. Many of us came here and others we never saw again. Melino nodded. It sounded like her father was much more hands-on when it came to the judging on the souls that came into his domain. These days, he left it to his 3 judges. Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. The trio had served as the judges of the dead for a long time. Though they did the job well, Melino felt the 3 took too many liberties with the power they wielded. All 3 had inflated egos. It was only natural with the given responsibilities they were possessed. Perhaps a change was in order soon. The man in the helmet was my father, Melino revealed, observing how Jiraiya's dark eyes settled on her. He's Hades, lord of the underworld. This time, Jiraiya nodded. You don't say. The name does ring a bell. Call him too curious, but he'd always wondered who the man in the helmet was. The memory was something that lingered in the back of his mind, even after all these years. He appeared out of nowhere, forming from a shadow that would have made the Naras envious. No one had sensed him. It was like he blinked into existence. He didn't give them time to react before they were all wrapped up into the shadows. The next thing anyone knew, they were in this paradise called Elysium, and it was to be their home until the end of time. Some faces disappeared entirely. They weren't as squeaky clean as the rest of them. He wasn't sure where they went, but he had a feeling they didn't go without putting up a fight, so he runs the show down here, and you're his heir? A princess. A scowl heavily marred Melino's face. Don't call me that. Mo, so serious. The goddess growled through her teeth, while Hecate rolled her eyes and listened to the back and forth. Jiraiya sure knew how to push Melino's buttons. She pitched in her thoughts on his words. As gods or goddess, we do not have heirs the same way mortal rulers do. Though Melino is the daughter of Lord Hades, that by no means sets her up as a candidate to one day rule the underworld. As immortal beings that live forever, we could potentially rule over our domains forever. Typically, there are 2 ways for a god or goddess to give up their rule over such things. Such as for that god or goddess to willingly separate themselves from their domain, though no immortal in their right mind would ever do such a thing. Our domains help make us what we are, Hecate explained, with Melino nodding along with her words. The second is for that immortal to be removed from the picture indefinitely. Jiraiya nodded. When you say indefinitely, you mean, he ran his finger across his throat with a knowing expression on his face. Correct. Boy, oh boy dash. Kia. I got you now. The sound of someone shouting caused the 2 goddesses to jump back in mild surprise before Hecate reformed her spear into her hands. They needn't have worried, as a blur dived out of one of the trees to the left, aimed at the white-haired spirit taking the lead. They both watched as a look of annoyance washed over his face, and saw as he sidestepped out of the way, and stuck one hand out. His hand grabbed the blur, spinning his body as he caught them in his grip, and hung them upside down. Incredible reflexes, both immortals thought. It was beyond anything modern demigods, and some gods could perform. He did it effortlessly too. Nice try Gaki, but you're still too young to pull one over on me, you know, Jiraiya exclaimed, grinning down at the body caught between his fingers. Try again in a few more centuries. Maybe you'll have better luck. He started poking the smaller body with his index finger, causing them to squirm and try to sway away. Mo, pervy sage. The body wiggled harder in the air, trying to escape though found little luck. Would you stop calling me that? Hecate and Melino snorted at the name. It was strangely appropriate for the man. As the 2 listened to the back and forth between Jiraiya and his assailant, the 2 lingered their gaze. The new spirit was a young girl, somewhere between 12 and 14. She was on the petite side with a light complexion, and dark blue hair cut into a bob. Melino found herself admiring the color. She'd never seen naturally blue hair before. At least, not on a human before. She was cute in the girl next door kind of way, with a round face and blue eyes. A striking feature both found themselves staring at was the 2 whisker marks on either side of her cheeks. Whisker marks. Melino thought. A familiar blonde barista had similar markings on his cheek if she recalled. Not to mention, the pull she was feeling for this girl in her gut was immensely strong. It was stronger than what she initially felt from Jiraiya. What are you doing here, Hima? Did your mom send you? Jiraiya asked, finally putting the girl on the floor. Despite the initial annoyance on his face, both goddesses could see the endearment in his eyes and voice. She must have been someone near and dear to him since she was trying to plant her foot in his face moments earlier. The girl patted her jumper down, before dazzling them all with a smile that struck all their hearts. Nope. Grandma sent me. She said to tell you to move your lazy butt. Otherwise, there'll be no food left for you, and we're making Boruto's favorite. Grandma said if you are not there soon, then you're going without. You know spirits don't need food. They don't need to peep, but you still do it. She shrugged her shoulders, looking at him with absolute innocence. Fine, fine. He replied, before pointing over to the pair of immortals watching them curiously. Can't you see I have guests following me? That's why I'm late. Why don't you say hello? Before Melino and Hecate could blink, the girl was in front of them. Her big blue eyes blinked up at them, filled with excitement and curiosity. Wow. You're new. The pair looked at one another. Hello, both said, greeting the young woman. We haven't had anyone new in forever. Like in a long time. She put her hands in the air to amplify how long. That's typically what forever means, Hecate told her in a matter-of-fact tone. They know. I said that already, Jiraiya replied, motioning for them to keep going and resuming the trip. Let's keep going. I don't want Kushina and Tsunade to have my ass for being late. But who are they? Why don't you ask them? It's polite to introduce yourself before asking for someone's name, remember? The little girl did just that, and spun around on her heel to face them again. Hi. I'm Himawari. Who are you? She poked her thumb into her chest. She's very peppy and spirited. They thought before Melino went ahead and explained who they were. Suffice to say, learning she was in the presence of two goddesses was enough for her eyes to sparkle in fascination and excitement. Wow. You're actual goddesses. We are. And you live forever. Last we checked. Wow. Does that mean you know my dad? Your dad? Hecate asked. The moment Melino heard that her thoughts began to spin. The image of Naruto Uzumaki appeared in her mind and started comparing his face with the little girl's. There was a great deal in their features that were alike. The blue eyes. The round face. The smile. The whisker-like markings on their cheeks. It was as if someone copied his likeness on this little girl. The one you're asking about, Jiraiya nodded his head towards her. Naruto's her father. Neither appeared surprised. Even Hecate, who hadn't met the blonde shinobi, had a feeling that the way it was leaning, I thought as much. The likeness is uncanny. Melino replied. Mom says I look a lot like my dad, but you should see Boruto, Himawari added, falling into step next to Hecate and surprising the elder-looking woman. With her hands behind her back, Himawari looked the picture of innocence. Boruto. My big brother. He's 3 years older, though I'm much more mature. Himawari looked proud of that statement, gaining a smug look. Even Mom says so. Grandma says girls mature quicker than boys, even if they're younger. I see. Are there any more kids we should be aware exist? Or does the drachma stop with you and your brother? Nope. Just the two of us. Himawari's face scrunched up in confusion. What's a drachma? The back and forth between Himawari and the immortals continued for the duration of the journey. The pair of immortals answered what they could, though every time Melino was about to respond with a question of her own, Himawari would beat her to it. If she didn't know any better, she would have said the girl had Aphrodite's divine essence running through her. However, she couldn't sense a single drop within her body and put that thought to rest. Eventually, after another 10 minutes of walking and making idle chat with their fourth companion, they found themselves at the end of the path with Jiraiya standing at an opening in the tree waiting for them. So, are you both ready? Ready? For what? To get your answers. He revealed, to understand who Naruto Uzumaki is and the man he is, you have to speak to the people who knew him the best. The people he affected while still alive and who made the biggest impact on him as a person. As much as I'd like to take all the credit, I'm but one factor to his makeup. To understand him, you have to speak to the people who love him the most. Both nodded and made a step forward when Jiraiya put his arm, blocking their path. What is it? Hecate asked, glancing at the man from the corner of her eyes. Her spear was still in her grip and toyed with it between her fingers. Deep down, a small part of her hoped he tried something. Despite being willing to aid Melino in her quest to know more about Naruto Uzumaki, the goddess of magic wanted to demonstrate his taking off her spear was a fluke. She wouldn't be caught unprepared again. I want to make one thing clear about what you're walking into. His dark eyes hardened. Despite being a spirit, an aura of authority hummed around him, reminding them both of the elder gods. It was a way to command the attention of the people in the room. I've let you come this far because I think you're honest in your intentions, and I like to think I'm a good read on people. Then again, I willingly admit that in the past, I've made some mistakes, and put my trust in the wrong people. The image of his former teammate flashed across his mind. All I'm going to tell you both is this. If I detect even a hint of deceit in your words, and about your intentions, you will be sorry. The air bristled around the two immortals, and both stood straighter. The atmosphere became heavier. Are you threatening us, spirit? Hecate asked, wishing now more than ever to poke him full of holes with her spear. It's not a wise course of action, Melino added, standing shoulder to shoulder with the elder immortal. The whites of their eyes began to glow, and shine with brilliant gold. One would have thought two goddesses like themselves standing side by side and facing down a single soul would have forced the individual to shudder in terror and regret speaking. Instead, the white-haired man backed up his claim by crossing his arms and staring them down, refusing to budge or show the change in the atmosphere bothered him. Himawari merely smiled off to the side, and patiently waited for them to finish with her hands clasped behind her back. Maybe not, but my words still stand, Jiraiya added. He showed no sign of letting the leak of power coming from the pair bother him. It looked like it barely tickled him. Allowing for cooler heads to prevail and seeing their show of strength wasn't having the desired effect, Melino was the first to lose her glow, followed soon after by Hecate. The power leaking out from them was only a small portion of their divine essence, but neither could afford to release anything higher. Otherwise, they run the risk of being noticed by Hades and Thanatos. We stand by what I told you earlier. We're here to learn and nothing more. Afterwards, we'll leave you all peace. A hum emanated from Jiraiya's throat, glancing at the two immortals for a moment. Just so you know, if you did try something, he pointed his thumb at the opening, the people on the other side will make you regret it. We might not have our chakra in death, but that doesn't make us useless. With that, Jiraiya spun around, walked through the entrance and made a motion for everyone to follow him. Himawari skipped along in front of them, and after a moment of letting his words sink in, Melino and Hecate followed suit. Just who in the world was waiting for them on the other side? And what was chakra? Stepping through the clearing, Melino found herself stopping after only a couple of steps through the opening in the trees. The area they were in was idyllic, and how mortals must imagine paradise. A small lake sat to the left of them with a bank of white sand settled between the water and the grass. On the sand, she spied a group of people with their backs to them, situated around a barbecue and a set picnic blankets. What made her stop, however, was the man waiting for the halfway between them and the group. If she didn't already know Naruto Uzumaki was alive, she would claim that he stood in front of them. The same blue eyes, and the shock of golden sun-kissed hair. He looked no older than his mid-20s. When the man began walking closer, Melino started to see the slight differences between them. The man's hair was longer, with bangs framing his face, and his face was more angular. He lacked the whisker-like markings on his cheeks too and held an aura of confidence around him. Looking at him with a hard gaze, she could tell he was the kind of man who would catch the attention of the goddess of wisdom. His eyes held an intelligence in them that would catch her attention with a glance. Jiraiya-sensei. It's about time you arrived, they heard the man reply, stopping a few feet from Jiraiya and smiling at the older man, and you brought guests. His gaze swept over them, and to their surprise, gave a small bow. It's nice to meet you. I'm Minato. Grandpa. Look. Look. Himawari skipped over to the man, and the pair watched as Minato put his arm around the girl and placed a delicate kiss on the top of her head. The act made the girl beam with delight. these are my two new friends, Melino and Hecate. They're goddesses. And they know Dad. This is Naruto's father. Melino realized in her head and shared a look with Hecate. The goddess of magic realized it too. He must have died young if he looks the same age as his son. Minato blinked in surprise. His mouth was trying to form words, but nothing was coming out. He turned to look at Jiraiya, who remained silent, though nodded his head to confirm her words. Audibly gulping, he asked, "You know my son?" A hopeful look was in his eyes. "We do." They came hoping to learn more about the blonde Gaki, Jiraiya mentioned, as he set off towards the group resting on the sand. The group were all looking their way, likely wondering who their guests were. I saw no harm. Instantly, Melino and Hecate found themselves ushered forward, with Minato gently guiding Melino forward and Jiraiya walking behind her at a leisurely pace. Hecate was being pulled forward by Himawari, the little girl with one of her hands on the goddess's wrist. Though surprised at how overly friendly the young girl was, she didn't fight it and make a scene. The girl appeared curious about her. She wasn't used to children acting in such a way around her. Most tended to keep their distance thanks to the mysterious aura she outputted. "Kushina. Come here for a moment." Minato called out, a sense of urgency in his voice. "You too, Mama." "Boruto." Himawari shouted, giggling all the while. Shrugging, Jiraiya added his voice, "Hime. You might as well too." Reacting to the voice, Melino watched as the four figures, now realizing they were the bodies of 3 women and a teenage boy, all got up and met them halfway. The first person Melino paid attention to was the teenage boy. It wasn't hard to determine who he was, given he shared the same blonde hair and blue eyes as his father and grandfather. The main difference was the scar that ran down his right eye, giving him the kind of appeal that would draw the likes of Aphrodite out from her temple. He was handsome too, not that it looks was doing anything for her. It was just something she noticed. He stood taller than the 3 women. From the women, the first she focused on was the woman in the middle. It was hard to look away. Her hair was the most beautiful shade of red Melino had ever seen and reached to her shins. It was perfectly straight, with it flowing from side to side like a velvety curtain. It was hard not to reach out and run her hand through to see if it was as silky as she imagined. Her eyes were the color violet, and she stood the shortest of the 3 women. Looking at her features, Melino could see distinct similarities between this woman and Naruto. The shape of her face. The shape of her eyes. Her smile. She could only be one person. The second woman also had a feature that caught her attention, though it wasn't her hair. Whoa! Look at the size of those. Admittedly, the first thing she noticed was the woman's chest. To say she was busta was an understatement. Her grandmother, Lady Demeter, was known throughout Olympus to be the bustiest of her fellow goddesses. Something she enjoyed lauding over them whenever she had too much of Dionysus's wine. This woman was comparable, if not a little bigger. If she was still alive, she had no doubt one of the gods would have tried to woo her. Along with her notable bust, her blonde hair fell into pigtails down to the middle of her back. Her eyes were also hazel. She was beautiful. Who am I kidding? All I can look at are those giant melons. Ending with the third woman, she too was beautiful and exotic looking. One look at the woman's indigo haircut into a bob was enough for Melino to know who she was. Like Naruto, many of her features passed down to Himawari. Her skin was a tone lighter than the other 2 women but stood the tallest out of the 3. She dressed conservative, but it did little to hide the curves sitting beneath the fabric. What was it with the women of the Golden Age? Why were they all stunning? Something in the water? Aphrodite wasn't born from the sea until centuries later, so there were no daughters of Aphrodite running around yet. Let me introduce you to 4 of the most important people in the Gaki's life, Jiraiya told her, and pointed at each one as they neared the group. The kid is Boruto, his son. Though you probably already figured that out. Melino nodded. The blonde woman is Tsunade, the 5th Hokage and my old teammate. You could say she was a motherly figure in his life, trying to keep him on the straight and narrow when his knucklehead ways got him into trouble. The redhead is Kushina, his mom, and Minato's wife. She runs a tight ship in their marriage if you know what I mean. He followed up his statement with a whip noise. In front of them, Minato turned and frowned at his sensei, earning a shrug from the older man. Finally, the lovely lady with indigo hair is Hinata, his wife and the love of his life. Though she figured that out already, Melino was grateful for the confirmations. "Who's this?" Tsunade asked the first to reach them with a raised eyebrow. She looked the two goddesses up and down, her guard up around the pair of strangers. "I've never seen either of them from around here, and we know everyone." "Who are you, girly?" "Girly." Melino and Hecate opened their mouths to speak, though Jiraiya beat them to it. Now, Hime. Is that any way to speak to a pair of goddesses?" Jiraiya asked. Instantly, both eyebrows rose from the state emerald. "Goddesses? Seriously, Jiraiya? How much sake have you been drinking?" "It's true. I swear. It's true, Grandma Tsunade. They are goddesses." Himawari added, letting go of Hecate and moving next to Tsunade, looking up at her with those big blue eyes. "Pervy sage wouldn't lie about something like that." "I think you give him too much credit," Tsunade mumbled, though patted the little girl on the head. Jiraiya slumped, his arms hanging in the air. "So mean, Hime. For good reason, you perv." "Okay, this is taking longer than I imagined." Melino thought and decided to intervene before an argument broke out. The blonde woman, Tsunade, looked ready to knock Jiraiya in the air if the twitch of her right fist was any indication. "He tells the truth. My name is Melino, goddess of ghosts and the daughter of Hades, ruler of the underworld." That piece of information was enough to catch their attention. "I'm here to learn about Naruto Uzumaki." Instantly, their backs all straightened and stared at the goddesses with something akin to wonder and shock. "You know my dad?" Boruto whispered, his eyes shimmering with a mixture of denial and hope. "I wouldn't say I know him, but I've met him," she revealed, their focus on her unwavering. "He's a peculiar man. Since he appeared, the gods of my family have been drawn to him like a flame attracts a moth. Your souls that predate my family, the Olympians. We are a family of gods that rule over much of the world in secret, doing so for over 5,000 years. Naruto Uzumaki, for reasons I failed to understand at first, had connections and ties to you all, which should be impossible. Now though, that question is answered given I have learned your relations with him." However, her frown deepened. A new question has appeared. "If Naruto Uzumaki was alive in your time, a time we refer to as the Golden Age, then how is he still alive all these millennia later?" As she spoke, everyone, Jiraiya, Himawari and Minato included, looked as if a fist hit them in the gut. Minato turned around and put his hands over his head, now letting everyone see his troubled expression. His wife moved over to his side, a dazed expression on her face, mumbling something to herself and shaking her head. "Minato. I know, Kushina. I know. Why isn't he here with us?" The question broke through as a sob escaped the red-haired woman, prompting her blonde husband to put an arm around her shoulders and bring her in close. 5,000 years. Jiraiya muttered to himself, shaking his head and looking at the ground. "Has it been that long?" Boruto added, his hands in his pockets and swallowed a thick gulp. "Time works a little different in here compared to the rest of the world," Hecate revealed, watching Himawari move to stand beside her mother. "After a while, time becomes distorted." Is he okay?" a muffled voice asked. The voice came from Hinata, the pale-eyed woman who had her mouth covered by her hands. Her knees looked ready to give out. Slowly, she was walking until she stopped a foot away from the goddess of ghosts. "Is he okay?" "For the most part," she revealed, revealing what she sensed from Naruto concerning his emotional ties to them. "He misses you all. He misses you all a great deal." A sob broke from Hinata. "We miss him. I miss him. Do you have any answers to my question? How after all this time, he's still alive?" She was hoping for some kind of answer that would fill in the blank pieces in her mind. If anyone knew, it must be the family. To her disbelief, it was Boruto who answered her, and it wasn't the answer she hoped to get. "We were hoping you might know that answer, because we don't know either." After the eventful day at the Fox's Den and finding himself forced to close early for the day, the blonde shinobi found himself entertaining his two guests at his home. Despite living in New York for nearly 6 months, this was the first time he had guests. Fortunately, he didn't need to worry about impressing either of them with the inside of his home. Any renovations he was making to the townhouse ended over a fortnight ago, leaving him pleased with the work he and his clones put in. One guest was still unconscious in one of the guest rooms. A glass of water sat on the bedside table, with a pack of aspirin ready and waiting for the oncoming headache the blonde woman was going to experience. He didn't envy her. Then again, she only had herself to blame. His other guest, though, he was entertaining in his kitchen, awaiting the dinner he promised her when transporting them from the den. Her dark blue eyes radiated excitement and licked her lips as the smell wafted around her nose. It was adorable. A glass that was half full of juice sat to one side with a tiny splash next to coaster. A stack of papers with colored pens and pencils sat neatly in the corner. Order up. One cheeseburger with no pickles and a side of curly fries for the little lady. Naruto called out, striding across his kitchen with the plate resting on his fingertips. Yay! The little girl cheered, eyes lighting up when the plate sat in front of her. Bringing Thalia and her mom to his home was not something he planned when the older woman fell into unconsciousness. His first train of thought had been to call the emergency services and have someone come and pick them up. In all likelihood, ending up drunk with your kid in tow would not go down well with the authorities. If the local child services got involved, they would inevitably conduct some form of investigation on the pair. They would want to know if today's actions on the mother's behalf for getting drunk in the middle of the day was a regular occurrence or a one-off. Either way, he'd been a second away from walking to his phone when he noticed eyes watching them from across the road, hidden behind the trash cans and dumpsters. Someone like Thalia, who gave off an aura that attracted the worst kind of creatures in her general direction, was like honey to a hungry bear. To him, monsters left him well enough alone, no matter which corner of the world. Let's just say, monsters, no matter the pantheon, chose to keep their distance from the shinobi. It wasn't in their best interest unless they wanted a one-way ticket to hell. Monsters, no matter what form they took a keen interest in demigods. It was like they were the special of the day on a menu for an exclusive diner that catered only to monsters. A rare treat that they couldn't ignore, no matter how hard they tried. Little Thalia, with the aura she didn't know she possessed, was like a magnet for those monsters. If it wasn't for his presence near the little girl, then he imagined those monsters would have tried to swarm the house if the opportunity appeared. He wasn't about to let that happen. So, before leaving the fox's den with Thalia clinging to his side, and her mother sleeping on his back in the form of a piggyback, he sent another clone to take care of the creature before it gathered its courage. When the memories of his clone returned to him, all he found was his clone landing on the shoulders of a wide-shouldered one-eyed man. He didn't give the creature a chance to react before twisting his body around and snapping the creature's neck with an audible crunching noise. The last thing he saw was the monster bursting into a cloud of gold dust before the clone dispelled himself. Taking a seat next to her at the little table tucked away in the kitchen, he watched with an amused smile as she tore away at the burger. He tried not to laugh, but the little girl had ketchup all over her mouth. She was about to wipe her mouth with her sleeve before he stopped her. Grabbing a napkin laid out on the table, he gently wiped her face. "We don't want ketchup and grease all over you nice clothes, do we?" He couldn't stop the smile on his face. "It doesn't matter. It's only clothes." The girl whined, causing him to chuckle. The way she wriggled around and pouted when he cleared her face reminded him of the times he did something similar for Boruto. Himawari was a little angel when it came to keeping herself clean. Boruto, on the other hand, was the polar opposite. If he saw a puddle in the street, his little boy had to jump in it, while Himawari would walk around it. Judging by Thalia's pouty face, she was in the same vein as his son. Then again, he was the same way at that age too. "I know, but I'm sure your mom spent a lot of money on them. We don't want to ruin them, do we?" The pout continued, and his smile widened when she let out a low huff. She was so cheeky. Before long, she was devouring the curly fries at an astonishing rate, reminding him of a particular customer who shoveled cake into her mouth like it was her last meal. At the very least, Thalia had better table manners and stopped to breathe. "Wow," he said, watching as Thalia finished the final few curly fries and looked up at him with those big blue eyes. "That was yummy." The little girl hummed, nodding her head, "Uh-huh. It was good." It was the best burger ever. Really? Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I don't get to make cheeseburgers and curly fries often, but I'm glad you liked it. She grinned up at him. They're my favorite. I could tell. I didn't think someone so small could eat it that quickly. I wonder where it all goes. Thalia's face scrunched up. I'm not little. Chuckling, he patted the top of her head. Despite having met a few hours ago, he got the chance to chat with Thalia as prepared her dinner. He listened to her retell the story of what happened with her mom in a way only a 4-year-old could. It took a few minutes to absorb the information, but he thought he understood the gist of what happened yesterday. According to Thalia, she and her mom lived in LA. At least, that's what he assumed when she said she lived in a house near the big word on the hill. She and her mom had gotten on a plane yesterday and flew to New York, with her mom bringing with them a suitcase full of dresses, shoes, and makeup. From the way she described them, it sounded like they weren't the cheap kinds either. He got the feeling Thalia didn't care much for dresses and made a face when she described her mom spending the whole night trying on different dresses and different shoes. When they woke up, she dragged Thalia out and told her they were going to see her father. Afterwards, she reiterated what he already knew. They went to the big building, the Empire State Building, and tried to get in the elevator. However, before they could step through the gates, a man stopped them and told them they couldn't go up. Her mom argued with the man, pulling Thalia in front of her and pointing to her. The man looked at her once but repeated the same thing over and over again. That's when her mom started shouting, demanding to see Zeus. Zeus. Naruto thought, his fingers tapping against the table. The big man of Olympus. The god of the sky. The king of the gods. And Thalia's biological father. He knew Thalia's divine parent had to be a powerful god, but he didn't think it would be that one. Mythology always pictured Zeus the same. A large, broad-chested man standing larger than any man had any right to be, wielding the power of lightning with his bare hands and casting judgment onto those who wronged him. He was married to a beautiful goddess, and yet couldn't help but be led astray and into the waiting arms of one woman to the next. In this case, that woman was Thalia's mom, and Thalia was the result of their union. Despite all his time walking the world, the blonde shinobi didn't have the pleasure of meeting the man. A part of him hoped he didn't have to. The god of the sky didn't provide him with the best impression. Eventually, Thalia's mom gave up and found herself in a bar not far from the famous skyscraper. Apparently, to his surprise, Thalia's mom was a famous TV actress. He wasn't big on TV, so this was news to him. When she stepped into the bar, no one paid any attention to the little girl that was with her. All they cared about was giving the celebrity free drinks and gaining some of the fame she carried with her. After a few hours, she wound up at the Fox's Den, and the rest was history. He could only imagine what someone of Thalia's age thought of the whole situation. A mother who drank her sorrows away, and a father who was absent for all her life. Her mom had done enough thus far for Thalia that she appeared to be happy and healthy. However, in his mind, a cocktail of chaos was slowly beginning to bubble up from within the small family unit. Thalia's mom had fallen into the hands of God and fallen for his charm. Now, despite being given the greatest gift of all, it still wasn't enough. Feeling someone pull on his shirt sleeve, Naruto broke out of his thoughts and turned to Thalia. "Sorry, Thalia. Did you say something?" "I said, what are we having for dessert?" He could see the excitement in her eyes. Seeing that look, how could he disappoint her? The smile returning to his face, Naruto stood up from his chair and tapped his chin. Let me think. He wandered over to the fridge and opened the door to the mini freezer. Building up dramatics, he reached inside and shuffled his hand to build up the dramatics. Thalia had turned around on her chair, her knees resting on the seat and her chin and fingers sitting on the backrest. The little girl gave Naruto her full attention as he continued to mess around. Pulling out his arm, he pulled out a big tub of ice cream and laughed when he got an excited yelp from Thalia. He could have made anything for the little girl. If she wanted it, then he would make it, no matter how long it took him. Cake, pie, tarts, anything. However, sometimes when you've had a hard day, and you needed comfort food, there was few better than ice cream. Sometimes, even he enjoyed taking the tub out of the freezer and chowing down with a spoon in his hand. Pulling out a little spoon for Thalia and a big spoon for himself, he flicked off the top of the tub with his thumb and planted it on the table between them. Handing her the spoon, Thalia was quick to notice the flavor. Chocolate, Thalia said in glee. Naruto winked at her and made her giggle. Chocolate was the best flavor. Of course. It's the best flavor. Scooping some up, he sighed happily as the rich taste of the ice cream enveloped his taste buds. You better take some, or I might eat it all. He heard the gasp from Thalia and watched the little spoon get put into action. Soon enough, her face covered in ice cream. Unlike before, he didn't wipe her face since he was aware of the streak of chocolate running down his chin. He heard Thalia giggle at his face, and stuck his tongue out in response. When she did the same, the two fell into a fit of giggles. All the while, one thought was running through his mind. Don't get too attached. It was hard not to. The little girl was like a breath of fresh air. A pure soul that he wasn't sure the world deserved. She would be gone once her mom woke up, returning to L.A., and he would be a memory she would forget. Hours later, Naruto found himself in the second guest bedroom, gently lowering Thalia onto the sheets. The little girl had been a bundle of energy after her dessert, and after a while, he found himself dusting off some old board games in the attic to keep her entertained. It was after the sixth game of Chutes and Ladders did Thalia's eyes begin to droop. He told himself it was only a matter of time. He stood correct when she released a series of yawns. Having the sense to send a clone to pick up an extra toothbrush while they played, he took the girl's shoes and socks off before lowering her head onto the pillow. He chuckled when a cute little snore broke out. She was asleep before her head hit the pillow. He pulled the covers up to her shoulders, watching with tender eyes as she shuffled around before falling still. Soon enough, the only sounds coming from Thalia were the sounds of her breathing. Good night, Thalia. He whispered, lowering himself to kiss the girl on the head but stopped himself halfway. A frown washed over his face, shaking his head as the realization of what he was doing hit him. Instead, he gently patted her on the shoulder and tiptoed out the room, leaving the halfway light on and the door ajar slightly. Most kids didn't like the dark. What a day this turned out to be. He muttered to himself, noticing the door to Thalia's mother's room was still closed. He was beginning to doubt the woman would be up until tomorrow. She already slept the rest of the afternoon and the evening away. Heading down the staircase, he picked up a small stack of paper on a side cabinet beside the doors and headed into his kitchen. Making himself a coffee, decaf, since he didn't want to be up all night, he settled in for the evening and took out a pen from one of the many drawers spread out through the kitchen. Ripping open the seal on the envelope, he sighed as he laid out all the bits of paper occupied inside. Bills. Everyone's favorite chores. These were the bills for the fox's den. All right. Let's assess the damage this time. It was around 11 p.m., just as Naruto had finished up his duties for the evening, that he heard movement coming from above him. The bills were paid and filed away, and the specials for the next couple of weeks finished when the familiar sound of feet hitting carpet reached his ears. Putting down his half-drunk second decaffeinated coffee of the evening, he focused on the movement coming from above. He closed his eyes. The footsteps wandered the guest room for a couple of minutes. She was likely gathering her bearings and trying to figure out where she was. It must have been disorientating waking up in a place you didn't recognize after binging harsh alcohol. Her head must have been killing her, and he hoped for her sake, she took the painkillers he left on the bedside table. After 5 minutes, he heard the sound of the guest room door open with a soft click and his guest walk into the hallway. The footfalls went all along the carpet, the clicks of doors opening as the woman checked each room. When she got to room Thalia was residing in, he listened to her walk inside, and approach the bed. He could picture it in his head, the blonde woman with her hair a mess kneeling next to the bed her daughter was sleeping peacefully in, her hand gently stroking the top of her hair. She would whisper soft nothings in her ear. Little things that a parent would say to their children while they slept. He smiled at the image. Instead, he was surprised to hear her say nothing, not even a whisper. She stayed in there for a minute top before he heard her leave the room. His eyes reopened as her feet hit the stairs and started descending to the ground floor. A frown formed on his face. What's she doing? He thought to himself. He slowly stood up and settled himself under the arch that connected the hallway and the kitchen, waiting for the woman to appear. A pit was forming in his stomach. One he hoped was over nothing. Eventually, Thalia's mom set foot on the ground floor, her shoes in one of her hands along with her purse. She stopped momentarily to let out a series of coughs, before wiping her mouth with her hand and rubbing it away on her clothes. He almost snorted at the action. It was the same action as her daughter from earlier. Patiently, he was waiting for her to turn around and notice him, watching as she slipped her feet back into her heels. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his breath hitched. Instead of turning around, her hand reached the handle for the front door. She wouldn't. Click. Aren't you forgetting something? The sound of his voice was enough to make the woman jump a foot in the air. She spun around and pressed her back against the door, pushing it to a close. Her wide eyes looked at him fearfully as he leaned against the wall, staring at her with a neutral gaze. Her blonde hair swept down one side, and her clothes were full of wrinkles from lying on the bed. Who are you? She breathed out, a large gulp rolling down her throat. One of her hands idly played with the door handle. Naruto Uzumaki. You came into my coffee shop, remember? He replied, or maybe you don't remember that. You weren't in the best condition when you came in. He made a motion with his hands, this is my home. I brought you here when you collapsed. She looked better and didn't look like a zombie trying to stay upright. Oh. What's your name by the way? I'm sure you have a name, besides being known as Thalia's mom. I'd like to know the name of the woman who collapsed at my place of work. Beryl. Beryl Grace. She replied, fear still laced in her voice, you don't know who I am? I'm pretty famous. An incredulous look briefly flashed on her face like she wasn't used to not getting recognized. To be famous in the modern world. The blonde shook his head, I'm afraid not. Thalia said you were an actress, but I doubt I've seen anything you've acted in. Why not? He shrugged, I'm not much of a television person, I guess. Never have been. Though, I catch the odd movie from time to time. The last movie he remembered seeing was Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace back in 1999. It was an experience. That's nice. There aren't many people like that these days. I'm a rare breed I guess, Naruto smiled, before adding, back to my earlier statement though. Where are you going? Thalia's still asleep. Don't you want to be here when she wakes up in the morning? I can make you both breakfast if you'd like that. I'm told by a reliable source that I make a damn good stack of pancakes. He hoped to see the woman react. Instead, Beryl didn't say anything. She averted her eyes from his and was trying to look anywhere else. It wasn't going in the direction he was hoping. Silence befell them before Naruto broke it with a deep sigh. It was a scenario that was getting worse by the second. Beryl didn't appear to want to give him an answer to his question. He could see her hand was still firmly on the door handle. Her thumb itching to twist and pull. You were trying to leave. He came out and said it aloud. The moment his words were spoken he noticed Beryl's shoulders twitch, and shuffle on the spot, you were trying to abandon your daughter in the home of someone you don't know. He wasn't exactly a stranger to Thalia anymore, but the statement still stood. He was someone the little girl had known for less than a day. No parent in their right mind would leave their child with someone they only just met. Beryl didn't react. Instead, she kept looking at the ground and averted her gaze. In a sudden move, her hand twisted the handle, pulling the door open and breathing fresh air into the house. She turned around and tried to run out the house, but was taken aback when Naruto appeared next to her. His hand was pressed on the door and guided it back to the lock. He stood there and looked at Beryl with a frosty gaze. Sheesh, otherwise you'll wake Thalia. How did you move so fast? She hissed, you were on the other side of the hallway. Who are you? The blonde shinobi was a little surprised she got over his speed so quickly but pushed it to the back of his mind. She must have been used to seeing strange things dating the god of the sky. Someone who cares, and who doesn't want to watch a little girl get her heart broken from being abandoned by the one parent she has left. He replied, you're her mother. You're supposed to be setting an example for her. I never asked to be a parent. Beryl glared back, finding some confidence and squaring her shoulders. It was never supposed to be the plan. Plans change. Not mine. My plan was simple because the only person I had to worry about was myself. A child was never on the to-do list. One hand clenched into a fist, awards and riches were supposed to mine. I have a talent few in America can match. I was told so by everyone. Then he shows up and gets me knocked up when everything was taking off for me. The venom behind her words surprised him, given how she'd gone begging to her lover's door just to see him. When Zeus showed up, you mean? Revealing his awareness to the father of her child was enough for Beryl to widen her eyes in surprise. You were calling out his name earlier before you collapsed. She looked like she swallowed a lemon, and pushed down a harsh gulp before asking, so you know. He nodded. I'm aware that the old myths are not as fictitious as we should believe. Can't say I've met Big Z. I'm not sure I want to if half the things I've heard are true. The gods and goddesses he'd met thus far were one thing, but the king was another matter entirely. He wasn't sure he was ready for someone with an ego that made teen Sasuke look like a chump in comparison. He waved a hand in the air, a mask of calm taking over his face. Look. I'm not going to tell you how to run your life. At the end of the day, you're an adult, and it's your life. You get the final say in it. However, he pointed up towards the stairs, as a parent, your actions have a ripple effect and cross over onto the lives of our children. They need us, and it's up to us to keep them safe and ensure they grow up to be happy. Do you have any idea what kind of effect your choices over the last couple of days have had on Thalia? Being dragged across the country, and forced to watch as the only parent she's ever known crumbles in front of her and throws herself into drunken oblivion. Beryl tried to speak, but Naruto didn't give her the opportunity and kept going. No, I don't think you do. Plans change. 9 times out of 10, life throws a curveball at us that change everything. You might not have the awards and riches you were hoping to have, but you have something far more precious. You have a beautiful little girl who calls you her mom. There are people in the world who would give up everything you mentioned to have that. Being a parent is a blessing. Having a child of your own who looks up to you, who needs your love and nurture is one of the best experiences we could have. Don't throw it away because life hasn't gone the way you hoped. All he could do was speak from the heart. Every word and the energy behind them came from his time loving and raising Boruto and Himawari, and how it made him feel watching them grow. Beryl truly didn't understand how lucky she was. Sure, she was a single parent, and that meant raising Thalia was going to be harder. She wouldn't have someone to lean on as other parents did. However, with only the two of them in their little family, it meant the relationship between mother and daughter would grow strong. When Thalia grew up, they could lean on each other. Being the parent of a demigod wouldn't be easy, but he felt they could push forward as long as they had each other. He hoped Beryl saw the light in his words. Are you finished with your speech? And his hopes were dashed as quickly as they appeared. He looked at her with a look of disbelief. He couldn't believe it. The woman looked at him square in the eye. There wasn't a hint of remorse or sadness in her eyes. All he saw was desperation. Desperation to get rid of the child that she felt was holding her back from attaining everything she dreamed of having. He couldn't remember the last time he met someone whose selfishness encompassed their whole being. Shaking his head, Naruto took a couple of steps back, giving Beryl the room to move around. His blue eyes bore into the woman, laced with anger, sadness, and disappointment. He raised his arm, extending towards the door. I won't stop you. All I can do is hope you see sense. As if she was hammering the nail into the coffin, Beryl scoffed. Smoothing down her clothes, she rose her shoulders to look composed. Beginning to walk, Beryl didn't even glance his way when moving past. She reached out and pulled the door open. There was no hesitation in her steps, nor did she turn to look back at the stairs that led to her daughter's location. Watching Beryl step outside, Naruto couldn't help but grit his teeth when he saw her shoulders slack. If he didn't know any better, he would have thought there was a weight on her shoulders, and it finally lifted away. For so long, Beryl must have seen her daughter as little more than dead weight in her life, causing her to sink further and further away from the life she desperately wanted. She'll never forgive you, Naruto said aloud as the woman's foot hit the sidewalk. If you walk away, I promise you it will be the biggest mistake you ever make. His words rang through the near-silent street, the cars and the few pedestrians passing by being none the wiser as to what was happening. Beryl, for a brief moment, stopped as she prepared to take her second step, and Naruto allowed a sliver of hope to worm its way inside. It looked like she was about to turn around by the way her torso shivered. Instead, he was left further disappointed as Beryl shook her head, her blonde locks swaying in the air before continuing to walk away. Naruto stood there on the steps of his home, watching Beryl and hoping she would come back. She never did. When she rounded the corner and disappeared from view, he couldn't contain his feelings anymore and swung his hand down on the metal rail running along with the steps. The bars dented on impact. He turned around and headed back inside. Closing the door behind him, he leaned on the door and closed his eyes as he took in what just happened. What do I do now? He muttered to himself. Right now, a demigod no older than 4 was sleeping soundly, unaware that the only parent she had in her life had walked away and out of her life. He might not have an answer, but he knew someone who could give him one. Pushing himself off the door, he walked into the living room and kneeled in front of the old fireplace that came with the house. Making the tiger hand sign, he performed a small fire jutsu to get a fire going before throwing a few extra pieces of wood to keep the fire burning. That'll do, he muttered to himself, feeling the heat of the fire brush against his skin. Leaving the room and walking back into the kitchen, he focused on the blue and white tin sat beside a wooden rack with half a dozen coffee mugs sitting neatly in rows of 3. Lifting the lid, a dozen cupcakes sat neatly in 2 rows of 6. The bottom row was decorated with swirls of strawberry frosting, while the top was filled with vanilla. He made them the day before and was glad he did. While they weren't necessarily needed, it did coax the person he needed to come quicker. Food was the best method to entice a person after all. Taking one of the vanilla cupcakes, he walked back into the living room and kneeled by the fire. Sorry I waited this long to invite you over, but I could use your help. I'm in a bit of pinch. With that statement, he threw the cupcake into the fire. It took a few moments before the desired effect took hold. Instead of watching the sweet treat begin to burn, the flames wrapped around it before vanishing into smoke. He didn't have to wait long. Half a minute later, a gentle knock at the front door alerted him to the visitor, and a familiar aura appeared outside his home. Standing up and walking to the door, he grabbed the door handle and pulled the door open. His earlier grim expression washed away, and a small smile appeared on his face as his blue eyes found himself staring into a pair of warm brown eyes. The scent of toasted marshmallows wafted around his nose. In the palm of her hand sat the cupcake that vanished in the fire moments earlier, already half-eaten and with frosting decorating the woman's lips. He would have made fun of her, but he was too happy to see her to even think about doing it. The woman smiled at him as she gently wiped away flecks of frosting with her index finger. Her dark hair fell into ringlets around her face, swaying as she moved. Hello, Naruto. His smile widened. Hello, Hestia. That's it for part 5. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.